Welcome to the deep dive. All right, let's jump straight in. We're diving into some incredibly thought-provoking source material today. It's excerpts from a text written right in the middle of World War I. I mean, just imagine the context. The world is tearing itself apart, and this author is trying to figure out why.
Exactly. And it's not just a surface-level look.
Right. These pages give us one person's viewpoint around 1915, grappling with huge questions. What drives us? Why are societies set up like they are? Why does conflict, especially war, keep happening? And, maybe most importantly, what can we actually do about it?
That's the core of it. And what's really interesting is they aren't just blaming, say, political leaders or specific countries for the war. They're really undertaking a kind of radical reconstruction of how we think about society itself. The hope seems to be if we understand human nature better, maybe we can build a future where war isn't seen as inevitable.
It's definitely a heavy topic.
Well,
But the sources seem to drill down into these core forces shaping us, don't they?
they really do.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the author's key insights. We want to understand why they believed so many problems. War, flawed institutions, even our own unhappiness stem from these deep impulses. And how society, as it's often structured, kind of thwarts them. Get ready for some surprising connections, I think. Things you might not usually link together.
Yeah, we're going to pull out the most important bits from these pages. We'll look at critiques of the state, property, education, even marriage, but always through this lens of human nature and the possibility of, real change.
And we're sticking strictly to what the author presents here, right?
Absolutely, just what's in the text.
Okay, let's unpack this first big idea. The author pushes back hard against the easy explanations for war. It's not just blaming one side or diplomatic mistakes.
No, they argue it comes from something much deeper, something in ordinary human nature.
Ordinary human nature. How so?
Well, they suggest war is accepted, maybe even welcomed by some, because there isn't this widespread, deep repugnance towards it. It's not common enough. And crucially, the beliefs people hold, even if those beliefs aren't strictly true, they act as a kind of index to our underlying impulses.
An index.
Yeah.
Like a clue.
Exactly. They even have this striking phrase, unfounded beliefs are the homage which impulse pays to reason. It's like our impulses cook up convenient reasons to justify what they want to do anyway.
Okay, wow. And here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive for me. They introduce this core idea. All human activity, everything, comes from just two sources, impulse and desire.
Yes, and they draw a sharp line between them. Desire is often conscious things we want, things we plan for.
Like wanting a promotion or planning a trip.
Right. Impulse, though, that's often blind, instinctive. It can seem unreasonable to others looking in. Now, obviously, blind impulses can be destructive, war being a prime example. But here's the kicker. The author insists they are also the source of the very best things we create.
Like what?
Science, art, deep, passionate love. It all springs from that same impulsive wellspring.
So the goal isn't just to clamp down on impulse with reason.
Apparently not entirely, because, according to the author, a life lived only by conscious purposes and desires without that impulsive energy. Well, it's exhausting. It drains your vitality.
That raises a big question then, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If reason and willpower aren't enough to control destructive impulses, like the ones leading to war, what is?
Yeah, and the author's answer is pretty striking. Only passion can control passion.
Meaning?
Only a contrary impulse can check an impulse. So the path isn't just changing our conscious thoughts or plans. The very life of impulse itself needs to change direction.
Towards life and growth, not death and decay, as they put it.
Precisely. The direction is key.
Okay, that makes a kind of intuitive sense. You can't just logic your way out of a powerful feeling. It needs redirection or to be met by something equally strong. Now, shifting slightly, the sources talk quite a bit about individual growth. There's an analogy.
Yeah, it's simple but quite powerful. Men, the author says, are like trees. They need the right conditions, the right soil, the right environment to flourish.
And if they don't get that?
Then growth is impeded. It's blocked or maybe nourished in a warped, unhealthy way.
And this ties into their critique of institutions.
Very much so. The author argues that many of our modern institutions, often inherited from simpler times and based on authority, they actually hamper this natural, healthy growth for most people instead of nurturing it.
Hamper it how? What does that look like?
It creates what the author calls a sense of intimate disunion.
Intimate disunion.
Hmm.
That sounds troubling. What does that mean?
It's like feeling fractured inside, out of sync with yourself, a conflict between your inner nature and what society demands.
Okay.
And this state, this disunion, makes it incredibly hard for people to break down the walls of the ego.
The walls of the ego.
Yeah, those sort of internal barriers of self-absorption, isolation. It prevents genuine growth, which the author believes comes through real connection, real union with others.
Ah, so the system itself can create this internal alienation that stops us from connecting deeply. And this thwarted growth, it has consequences, right? Serious ones.
Oh, definitely. The author's quite explicit. Impulses that are harmful to others, malevolence, destructiveness, they tend to result from this kind of thwarted, inhibited growth. They're least present, apparently, in people whose instinctive development was relatively unimpeded.
Wow. So things like hatred aren't just inherent evil.
Not primary, no. They're linked to being crippled in less obvious ways, stunted emotionally, psychologically, by an unsupportive environment. The author even uses a pretty stark phrase from the era about the malevolence of hunchbacks and cripples to make this point about psychological damage.
That's quite harsh, but I see the point they're making about inner crippling.
And they have this real belief that if true freedom could be achieved, if the environment allowed for healthy growth, hatred itself would largely wither away.
That's a powerful, almost optimistic idea that hate is a result, not a fundamental cause. And here's a critical point that offers some hope, I think. The author doesn't see instinct as fixed, right? It's changeable.
Exactly. It's malleable. It's shaped by our beliefs, our circumstances, our social setting, the institutions we live under.
So it's not predetermined.
No, the same underlying instinctual energy, depending on the outlets society provides or encourages, could lead to amazing artistic creation, or it could fuel a destructive love of war.
So this challenges the idea that we just have to accept harmful instincts as inevitable.
Right. It suggests society's role isn't just damage control, not just policing bad behavior. It's about actively adapting our institutions to fit our current instincts and beliefs, which the author notes have changed drastically since, say, the 18th century. We shouldn't cling to outdated forms.
Institutions need to foster connection, growth.
Precisely. They need to embody common purposes people can genuinely connect with, foster instinctive liking among people, and promote natural growth by satisfying fundamental needs in healthy ways.
Okay, let's turn to one of the author's biggest targets, the state. Especially in wartime. How do they define what the state essentially is?
Well, they see it primarily as the holder, the repository of the collective force of its citizens. It's the organized structure that wields power both inside its borders, through law and police.
And outside through the military.
Exactly. And that force is used very differently.
How so?
Internally, against citizens, there's a legal code, rules, but externally, against other nations. The author argues there's no real equivalent code. Force is used much more freely. The state's external actions are described as inherently selfish, driven by exploiting others, seeking power, prestige.
Though sometimes moderated by needing other states' goodwill, they mentioned?
Yes, a slight modification, but the core drive remains.
And this directly connects to war, doesn't it?
Starkly. The author argues the state's power outside its borders comes mainly, almost entirely, from war or the constant threat of war.
And its power inside its borders, what maintains that?
Largely, it's based on two key fears within the population.
Which are?
Fear of internal chaos, crime, anarchy, and fear of external aggression being attacked by other states. Plus, there's what the author calls the religious aspect of patriotism.
Patriotism. They see it as more than just love of country.
Oh yes, much more complex. They break it down. There's genuine love of home, family, the land. There's a natural liking for your compatriots. There's pride in the community's achievements, belief in national ideals.
But there's another element.
Yes, a crucial one. An element of worship. A willingness to sacrifice oneself for the state, almost like a religious duty.
And it's that worship part, particularly, that the author takes issue with.
Deeply. Patriotism, viewed as a religion, is seen as fundamentally flawed because it lacks universality.
Meaning it's exclusive.
Exactly. Its ultimate goal is only the good of one's own nation. This inherent exclusion, they argue, inevitably leads to conflict with others, or at least indifference to damage done to outsiders. National pride ends up poisoning the potentially good aspects, making it, in the author's view, inferior to any belief system aiming for the well-being of all humankind.
So, summing up this critique, what are the main harms caused by the state as it existed then?
The chief harm, according to this text, is its incredible efficiency in war.
Efficiency in war, how is that the chief harm?
Because by successfully suppressing violence within its borders, which sounds good, the state paradoxically makes violence outside its borders much easier and more effective. It creates this artificial, dangerous division of humanity.
Wow. So the very thing that keeps internal peace enables external war. That's a critical insight.
It really is. The author argues the state becomes evil through its exclusions and its capacity to become, quote, a combination of men for murder and robbery and aggressive wars. The whole system seems irrational. Why treat internal and external anarchy so differently?
And why do people support it then, despite these flaws?
Well, partly because it feels like the only safety net, the only guarantor of security. And for some, it offers the psychological pleasures of triumph and dominion over other groups.
The author also mentions the size of modern states. That has an effect too.
Yes, they argue the sheer scale makes individuals feel politically impotent, completely powerless, even in a democracy. And they assert that the main goal of almost all powerful states is ultimately power, especially power related to war, which inevitably leads to restricting citizens' own liberties.
Rooted in pride and fear, they say.
Pride and fear. And there's bias too, isn't there?
Yes, they point out a clear bias, especially in things like labor disputes. Governments tend to side with employers, they argue, because the officials come from or want to be part of that class.
And internationally.
State decisions tend to reflect what sheer force could achieve, not necessarily what's objectively just.
Okay, so that's a heavy critique, but they don't just want to tear it all down, do they? What should the state do?
Correct. It's not pure anarchism. They propose positive functions based on two principles. First, ensure a universal minimum standard for community well-being, things like sanitation, and importantly, compulsory education.
Okay, a safety net function. And the second?
Intervene to prevent injustices that arise, because the law doesn't act. They give the example of private land ownership, arguing the state should actually collect the economic rent from land.
That's quite radical, essentially nationalizing land value.
It is. But then there's this tension, isn't there? Giving the state more positive functions could conflict with individual liberty, which they also value highly.
Right. How do they resolve that?
Well, this is where their vision gets interesting. Instead of just piling more power onto the central state, they suggest protecting liberty by empowering voluntary organizations.
Groups based on shared interests, not just geography.
Exactly. Things people choose to join based on purpose. The state could then act more like a federal authority or an arbitrator, making sure different interests find some kind of settlement rather than being the ultimate boss of everything.
That sounds like a shift towards decentralization.
It does. The author sees this tendency maybe starting in democracies, but feels it's constantly derailed by war, or even just the constant fear of war. That fear diverts the state, turns it into what they call a Moloch, this ancient deity demanding sacrifice.
Sacrificing individual development for the sake of the national struggle for power.
Exactly.
Okay, so the state is a major problem. But the critique extends further, doesn't it, to the economic system, too?
Oh, absolutely. It gets hammered. The author calls the modern industrial economic system, quote, the most destructive of life that has ever existed, with the possible exception of slavery.
Wow. That's incredibly strong language. Why so destructive?
They blame industrialism for making work, for most people, just wearisome, monotonous, soul-crushing, really. And this, they argue, actively checks the creative impulse. That vital energy gets blocked.
And when it's blocked?
It gets redirected towards destructive things like envy, conflict, resentment.
And because people just work for wages, they have no real stake or choice in what is being made.
Right. The purpose belongs entirely to the employer. The worker's only purpose becomes the wage itself, which naturally leads to conflict of interest.
Do they look at any potential fixes, alternatives?
Briefly. They mention things like the cooperative movement, where consumers and capitalists are kind of merged, and syndicalism, where producers and capitalists are merged.
Sort of worker control.
Yeah. They suggest maybe a mixture of these could cure many of the evils, though they admit neither approach fully aligns all interests, but they're steps away from just pure profit motive.
This connects to another big critique, doesn't it? The whole worship of money.
Yes. And it's not just about being greedy.
What is it about then?
The author sees this excessive focus on getting money, especially in industrial societies like America, England, post-war Germany, as both a symptom and the cause of something deeper.
Okay.
A decay of life, a diminishing vitality. Instead of pursuing specific, creative goals that require effort and produce something real, people chase money because it buys passive enjoyment. It buys respect and power without needing real exertion or a clear purpose beyond just having more.
So it becomes a substitute for actually living a full creative life.
That seems to be the idea. And this theme of stifled creativity carries right into their critique of education.
Yeah, the education system takes a real beating, too.
How so?
They see it as maybe the strongest force propping up the status quo. It's used by the existing powers, the state, the economy, traditional morality, to basically instill respect for themselves.
Treating children like material.
Exactly their word. Material to be molded into predetermined shapes that fit the system.
So what should education be doing, according to the author?
Something fundamentally different. Instead of teaching kids what to think, it should aim at making them able to think critically for themselves.
And the current system fails that.
Massively, they argue. Standardized systems, huge classes, overworked teachers. It all shows a fundamental lack of reverence for the child. A failure to respect their natural curiosity and potential, trying to force them into an unnatural shape.
Lack of reverence for the child.
Yeah.
That's powerful. So instead of obedience and just accepting things,
Education should foster wonder, constructive doubt, questioning things productively, a love of mental adventure, the joy of exploring ideas.
and the feeling of accomplishment through thought.
Yes, that sense of conquering problems, understanding the world through your own thinking. But the author believes there's a deep fear of that kind of thinking.
By fear.
Because genuine critical thought is seen as subversive and revolutionary by those in power. So education gets dominated by preserving the past, maintaining control, rather than empowering individuals to create a better future.
It really loops back to that core idea of vital impulses being shut down. What about social norms? They touch on things like religion and marriage, too.
They do. They see traditional religion and marriage laws, especially in England at that time, as based on outdated principles that just don't fit modern life anymore.
Leading to
Widespread hypocrisy, people living double lives, having secret relationships, because the official rules are so out of touch with actual human needs and complexities.
And there's a point about population that feels surprisingly current.
It really does. The author observes the birth rate declining and notes it's happening most among what they call the best elements, people with prudence, energy, intellect.
Why?
Partly the financial cost of raising children, but also women increasingly wanting freedom, careers, lives beyond just domesticity.
And the author's concern about this trend is
That it acts as a kind of negative selection. It could potentially lower the overall mental standard of the population over time. They worry that if birth rates rise again, it might only happen on a much lower plane of civilization, selecting for people who are perhaps less thoughtful or whose values are solely focused on motherhood to the exclusion of other things.
that's a controversial point. Do they offer solutions?
They suggest making childbearing less of a financial penalty, maybe making education fully a state responsibility to ease the burden. And they argue strongly that marriage laws need reform, recognizing divorce is necessary for the complexity of modern relationships.
Okay, so the author paints a pretty grim picture of how institutions can thwart our growth and misdirect our impulses. But they don't leave us there, do they? They offer a path forward. They introduce these two concepts, the life of the mind and the life of the spirit. What are those about?
Right. The life of the mind. That's about impersonal thought, pursuing knowledge just for its own sake. Science, philosophy, learning about the world objectively.
And the life of the spirit.
That's more about impersonal feeling, developing an interest in others that goes beyond your immediate circle. A sense of reverence, maybe awe, a connection to something larger than your own ego, a sense of mystery.
And how do these two things help fix the problems we've been discussing?
They're presented as essential for bringing health and balance back into our instinctual life, especially when our creative impulses get blocked by things like the industrial system or restrictive social norms. They provide non-possessive, non-destructive outlets for our vital energy.
So, take patriotism, which they criticized earlier. How does spirit help there?
Well, patriotism is instinct-based, that tribal feeling. The life of the spirit is needed to extend that natural love and connection beyond just your own nation, to embrace all of humanity. It purifies patriotism of its exclusive, often dangerous side.
And similarly for parental love.
Exactly. A powerful instinct, but spirit helps broaden that devotion, that care universally, rather than keeping it narrowly focused.
So spirit integrates things. It helps harmonize our thinking mind and our instincts, connecting us not just to our small group, but to, Well, everyone.
That's the idea. It restores harmony. It unites the individual with mankind. And for people deeply engaged in thought, the author suggests, spirit is crucial for finding real happiness and peace, stopping intellectual pursuits from becoming cold or detached.
This all sounds very grand, very philosophical. But what about us? The individual feeling pretty small against these huge forces, the state, the economy, institutions that have been around forever. What can we actually do? Does the author offer practical steps?
Well, they're realistic. They admit we can't just snap our fingers and cure war or instantly dismantle flawed systems. Change takes time. But their answer is actually, I think, quite profound and empowering.
Yeah, just.
The most critical first step is to get absolutely clear in our own minds, clear about the kind of life we want to live and the kind of societal change we genuinely desire.
So it starts internally, with clarity of vision, not with protests or politics necessarily.
That's the starting point. They argue that the ultimate power of clear, vital thought, even if it seems small and insignificant right now, has historically been immense. Think about big shifts like religious toleration or the rise of democracy. They didn't start with armies. They started with the clear, persistent thinking of a few individuals who dared to question the way things were.
That takes courage, though, and probably, well, it might be lonely.
Definitely. The author says this path requires intellectual detachment, being able to step back and think for yourself, away from the crowd. It requires solitary energy, a willingness to do the hard thinking and feeling, maybe alone, and yes, potentially being lonely for a while.
But not cut off.
No, that's crucial. Without becoming aloof or cynical or looking down on others. It's a difficult balance, they admit, but they insist it's not impotent. Thinking clearly matters.
So the goal isn't to write a detailed blueprint for some perfect utopia.
No, not a rigid plan. The political theory needed isn't a fixed destination. It's a deep understanding of the forces actually at play right now, the destructive ones and the creative ones, and then having a clear intention to consciously direct those creative forces towards life, towards growth, towards constructive ends.
Because the current system often defeats that creative impulse early on.
That's what they argue. Many professions, the whole structure, can inflict a kind of defeat on our creative spirit right from the start.
So if you had to boil it down, what's the single supreme principle the author advocates for both our private lives and for politics?
It's stated very clearly. To promote all that is creative, and so to diminish the impulses which center around possession.
Creative versus possessive. Why is that distinction so important?
Because creative impulses, making things, discovering things, genuine love, building relationships, they tend to be harmonious. My creating something doesn't inherently stop you from creating something.
Okay.
But possessive impulses, the desire to own, to control, to dominate others or resources, these inevitably cause conflict. Because if I possess something, often that means you can't. My gain is your loss.
And just focusing on our own feelings, our own internals, what they call subjectivism, that's also a problem.
Yes. Living life just chasing your own feelings or sensations, like only seeking amusement for how it makes you feel, or defining love only by the emotion you get from it. The author sees this as making life feel fragmented, isolated. A truly satisfying life, one that feels whole and connected, comes from directing our energy outwards, towards objective goals, projects, people, ideas, causes that exist beyond just our own skin.
Okay. As we wrap up this deep dive, the author leaves us with some really powerful, maybe challenging final thoughts. What are the key takeaways they hammer home?
Well, they circle back to the idea that the roots of war, but also the roots of opposition to war, lie in these deep human impulses. And any political theory worth its salt has to understand these impulses and aim to make them fruitful, aim them towards life.
And the current industrial system.
It's seen as fundamentally destructive to that life impulse. They float the idea of an industrial federal democracy, something more decentralized, more democratic in the economic sphere, as a possible direction for reform, but it's not a rigid prescription.
And our personal philosophies matter.
Immensely. How we choose to live, what we value it, directly impacts our vitality, both individually and as a society.
The vision for regeneration, for building something better, it sounds like it demands a lot from individuals.
It really does. The best life, the best society, in this view, is one that consistently prioritizes the creative over the possessive. And shifting our energy away from that desire for power over others, well, it requires individuals willing to potentially face hardship, loneliness, opposition, maybe even poverty.
All for the sake of living by truth, love, and what they call rational hope.
Rational hope, not blind optimism, but a reasoned belief in possibility.
And they end with a really poignant, almost damning thought about the generation that led the world into World War I.
Yeah, it's incredibly strong. They mentioned St. Augustine writing his City of God as Rome was falling, suggesting we need to do something similar, build a better world first in our thought, in our minds. But the sheer tragedy of the war, the sacrifice of millions of young people, the author sees it as revealing a profound lack of spirit, a kind of spiritual death in the older generation who sent them to die.
They died for what?
For the older generations, evil passions, spiritual death, failure to live generously, it's brutal.
It really is.
The author basically says it's the older generation who are the dead ones, and they can only be brought back to life, metaphorically, by the ghosts of the young they sacrificed, holding them up to shame, demanding that life, real life, must come out of all that death.
A truly stark call for accountability and fundamental change.
Wow, okay, that was certainly a deep dive into a really challenging and, frankly, quite unsettling perspective,
Yeah.
especially considering it was written over a century ago during that awful conflict. It's just striking how this author saw the roots of something as huge as World War I and so many other problems, tied not just to, bad politics, but to these fundamental things about us, our impulses, our need for healthy growth, and how our institutions can either nurture that or tragically stifle it and twist it.
Absolutely. The critique really hits hard, doesn't it? The state geared towards war and power, the economy crushing creativity, education stifling real thought, even our personal lives constrained by outdated ideas, and it all keeps looping back to this core theme: thwarted vitality, misdirected impulse leading to destruction and unhappiness. Yeah. And the call to action isn't just, vote differently or change a policy here or there. It's much deeper. A change of spirit, really. Cultivating creative impulses over possessive ones. Facing loneliness, if necessary, for the sake of clear, vital thinking, and building that better world, first in our own minds, guided by wisdom and, well, a difficult kind of hope.
It definitely makes you pause and think, doesn't it, about the impulses driving things today, in our own time, and how our current institutions, maybe in ways we don't even notice anymore, might be shaping those impulses.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, what stands out most powerfully to you from this author's perspective? How do you see these century-old ideas about impulse or thwarted growth or the nature of the state playing out now?
And maybe here's a provocative question for you, listening, based on that supreme principle the author laid out. If the goal is always to promote the creative and diminish the possessive, where, in your own life or in the systems you deal with every day, do you see vital creative impulses being most blocked or discouraged? And where do you see the most destructive possessive impulses being rewarded, maybe even celebrated?
Definitely a lot to ponder there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into a perspective that feels both very much of its time and yet strangely, persistently relevant. We hope it gives you some valuable insights to take away.